career at the Academy, including a 4-year term as department chair, Dr. Symonds was the first person to win both the Academy's Excellence in Teaching Award, and that was in 1988, and its Excellence in Research Award in 1998. He received the Navy Meritorious Service Award in 1989, and the Superior Civilian Service Medal in 1994, 1998, and 2005. In 1994 to 95, he served as Professor of Strategy at the Britannia Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, England. From 2011 to 2012, he served as the Class of 1957 Distinguished Professor of American Naval History. From 2017 to 2020, he was the Ernest J King Distinguished Professor of Maritime History at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, for which he received his 4th Superior Civilian Service Medal in 2020. Professor Symonds is the author or editor of 29 books, including prize-winning biographies of Civil War figures General Joseph E. Johnston in 1992, Patrick Claiborne in 1997, and Franklin Buchanan in 1999. In 2005, his book, Decision at Sea, 5 Naval Battles That Shaped American History, won the Theodore and Franklin D. Roosevelt Prize for Naval History, and his 2008 book, Lincoln and His Admirals, Abraham Lincoln, the U.S. Navy, and the Civil War, won the Barrondes Prize and Lanning Prize, the Lehman Prize, the Lincoln Prize, and the Abraham Lincoln Institute Book Award. In 2014, he was awarded the Dudley Knox Medal for Lifetime Achievement, and more recently has focused on World War II naval issues. His book on the Battle of Midway was published in 2011, and Neptune, the Allied invasion of Europe and the D-Day landings in 2014, won both the John Barry Prize and the Samuel Eliot Morison Prize. His newest book is World War II at Sea, A Global History, published by Oxford, which was published in 2018 and has been translated into Spanish, French, Chinese, and Polish. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Craig L. Symonds.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Gosh, after an introduction like that, I guess I'll just take questions. No, I do have some opening comments to make, and then I hope we do have some questions. That's usually the most fun part of a presentation. I'm honored to be on board this vessel today, and I really want to thank Bob for the effort that he went to make sure this happened. I do have a kind of connection with the New Jersey, although it's rather tenuous. I'm going to tell the story anyway. As Ryan mentioned, I was at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island for 3 of the last 4 years, 3 years in a row from 2017 to 2020. And the job I had, the Ernest J King professorship, comes with an office. And in that office is an enormous desk built of blonde wood, but it's a standing desk with a platform about where this podium is located. It has shelves above and compartments on the side, probably for the hanging of uniforms in case of the need for a quick uniform change. And we don't know for sure what the provenance of that desk is, but here's what we know. It was found in a crate in a storage warehouse in Bremerton, Washington, and labeled as being taken off the New Jersey when it was decommissioned there for the second time in 1991. So here's my speculation. This is the desk built probably by the ship's carpenter for someone who liked to work at a standing desk on the New Jersey. And who could that possibly be but Raymond Spruance? If you don't know, Ray Spruance, Vice Admiral Spruance, subsequently Admiral Spruance, liked to work standing at a desk, didn't like to sit down, and he had no chairs in his office because he didn't want other people to come in there and sit around and waste his time. They would come in and start a conversation and kind of look around for a place to sit, and there wasn't any place to sit, so they'd leave, which is exactly what Spruance had in mind. So my speculation is that I worked for 3 years adjacent to the desk that was on board this ship in 1944 and 1945. I can't swear to it, but I'm pretty sure that's true. I did not work at that desk, by the way. I do sit down when I work, unlike race fluence. And I'm perfectly willing for people to come and waste as much of that time as they want. So I had several other chairs in the room as well, but it was kind of fun to have it there just the same. I'm not going to talk about race fluence today, though, as much as race fluence is an interesting character, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about any aspect of World War II or the command leadership. But I thought I would talk particularly about two men who were at the top of that command pyramid, and that's Admiral Ernest J King, and in particular, Chester Nimitz. I just finished writing a book about Chester Nimitz as a wartime commander, Nimitz at War, the subtitle of which, if I can remember it from my own book, is effectively Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. And that was what I was interested in. Command leadership. How did Nimitz and King, these two extraordinarily different characters, managed to work so effectively together to conduct the Second World War in the Pacific? Okay, that's my topic. And I'm going to go to my notes to see what I want to say about it. Nimitz, let me start first with Nimitz. Nimitz was a calm, deliberate, thoughtful, cerebral, patient kind of commander. None of those words could be applied to Ernest J King. I'm not even sure he knew they were words. Nimitz smiled readily, but it was often a tight-lipped, almost enigmatic smile. If you've seen photographs of him, he almost always has that sort of grim, determined look on his face. And a lot of people, when they first met him, assumed this said something about his personality or character, but that, in fact, is not true. Here's a piece of information revealed here, perhaps for the first time. Nimitz had terrible teeth. He had grown up in the hill country of Texas, never saw a dentist until he was in the Navy, and I got his 1941 dental report supplied to me by his grandson. If I can do this right, it said the following teeth are missing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 23, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. Yikes. And the 5 teeth that remained were all gold. And embarrassed by that, Nimitz's default expression was this tight-lipped, almost skeptical expression. But as soon as you met him, you knew that was not, in fact, a reflection of his personality. First of all, he spoke softly. He spoke like this, calmly. People would tend to lean in to hear what he had to say. And another thing that was immediately evident was that he listened carefully. He was interested in what you had to say. And those characteristics led his staff and others who worked with him to be genuinely committed to him. He was also restrained in his response to crisis. No one ever saw him angry. No one ever saw him panicked. If he was truly upset, his grandchildren told me that you knew he was mad when he said, "Gosh all hemlock." Now, that may suggest he was something of a prude, but that's not true either. He loved to tell stories, and many of the stories that he told were a little bit risque. When he would start to tell one of those in mixed company before the war, his wife, Catherine, would stop him and say, "No, Chester, no, don't go there." He was not religious. He did not believe in an afterlife. He did not believe in the divinity of Jesus. But he was tolerant of other people's views. His daughter eventually became a Dominican nun and spent her life as a Dominican nun. One day when he attended church with his family just before the war, they were all in the church and they had gone out. When they got outside, they looked around, where was Dad? He was not in sight. So one of his daughters went back into the chapel and found him kneeling in the pew. And she said, "Daddy, I'm amazed. Are you praying?" And he said, "Hell no, I've got a cramp in my leg and I can't get it up." He was not naive. Another aspect of his character was an acute political sensitivity. He knew almost instinctively which administrative or command level battles were worth fighting and which were not, which simply had to be tolerated. An admiring staff officer said he could work with people with a certain amount of give and take to attain what he started out to do in the first place without ever giving the appearance of issuing an order. Very different from Ernest King, as we'll see in a minute. Now, some looked upon these characteristics as examples of weakness. A few categorized him as a political general. He did, after all, spend consecutive terms in Washington, D.C. as the head of the Bureau of Navigation. But they utterly mistook their man. Nimitz was political in terms of his sensitivity to the political aspect of command decisions, but he was political in the way that Ulysses S. Grant or Dwight Eisenhower were political. That is, he understood that military decisions, including naval decisions, often had a political aspect and needed to be aligned. He behaved similarly with his subordinates. He often listened to them quietly. He invited their input. He didn't interrupt when they were making a point. As one recalled, he always gave a person a chance to have his say. He might not accept your advice, but you always knew that you had your full day in court. He almost never pulled rank. No one ever heard him say, "Because I said so." Instead of that, if he had to overrule the advice the subordinate was giving him, he used it as a teaching moment to explain why, so that the subordinate came around eventually to understand, oh yeah, I see now, I get it. He looked like an admiral. He had, if you've seen photographs of him, snow white hair. Led a few younger staff officers occasionally to refer to him as Cottontail, but only behind his back. But his most arresting features were his eyes. He had cornflower blue eyes, and if you can imagine that in a tanned and weathered face and white hair, those blue eyes were almost like they were illuminated. Some contemporaries found them startling. One officer subjected to his gaze said it seemed to penetrate clear through the back of my head. If Nimitz was angry, one junior officer recalled those blue eyes sort of flashed. But more often, when those eyes flashed, it was with humor, though usually a quiet humor. He did not tell jokes. He told stories that had a humorous twist. Many of them were shaggy dog stories with a lengthy, even an interminable buildup. During social evenings back in the States, before the war, his wife would often interrupt him and say, "Oh, let me tell it, you take too long." One of his favorites, you ready, was about a young doctor who arrived at the home of a nervous father-to-be. Now, don't worry, he told the father, everything is just going to be fine. Just let me handle it. After a minute or two, he came out, and he asked for a butter knife. His father went and got it, handed it. A few minutes later, he came back, and he asked for a screwdriver, which his father got, provided. Then it was a pair of pliers, or a stiff wire with a hook on the end. Now, depending on his audience, this would go on for some time. He would pause after each of these and let you catch up with him. Finally, the prospective father, and by now probably his audience as well, and perhaps you too, got a little impatient about it and couldn't stand it anymore. "Doctor," he said, "is everything okay? Has something gone wrong?" "Oh, yes, everything's fine. I just can't get my bag open." Well, that's the punchline. I mean, it's not a knee slapper, but it says something, I think, about Nimitz's ability to look at life's humorous moments. Now, some of these stories were, as I mentioned, risque, or perhaps I should say what was considered risque in the 1940s, when he would tell one of those in mixed company, as I mentioned, Catherine would stop him. But in his all-male quarters in Pearl Harbor, they were a staple of his evening dinners. If his guests moved from the dinner table to the card table afterward, which happened now and again, he might tell the story of the aspiring woman bridge player who was desperately eager to make her mark in the bridge-playing universe in her hometown. So she got an invitation to this woman's house who was considered the doyan of bridge players, and her husband came along, and she was very excited, wanted to make a good impression. But the husband, who was partnered with the hostess, played terribly. He forgot what suit they were in. He trumped his partner's ace. I mean, it was just a complete disaster. And then at the end of one rubber, he got up and said, I need to go to the bathroom, and he left the room. Well, when he did that, the wife turned to the hostess and said, I'm so sorry, let me apologize for my husband. And the hostess said, oh, no apology necessary. Although this is the first time all evening I was pretty sure of what he was holding in his hand. Okay, it takes a minute. Okay. Now, Nimitz also appreciated the humorous aspects of life in the service. I'll give one example of that. In 1934, while he was captain of the Augusta, flagship of the East Asian Squadron, he was holding captain's mast on the Augusta. This is non-judicial punishment that takes place periodically when the captain has to pass judgment on minor infractions. And a petty officer named Woolley was brought before him. Now, Woolley's division officer presented him and said, here's the charges, Captain. Woolley was found, when he was supposed to be on shore patrol, he was found in a house of ill repute with his uniform half off. Well, Woolley, Nimitz said, you got to say for yourself. Well, Captain, Woolley replied, it was this way. And then he went on to explain that he was on shore patrol duties and had inadvertently torn the sleeve of his jumper. And knowing that Nimitz wanted the shore patrol to be turned out looking sharp, he knew this woman who had a sewing kit and asked her if she would sew it up for him. So that's why he was up in her room with his jumper off. She was sewing up his uniform. A smiling Nimitz congratulated Woolley on his brilliant defense and dismissed the case. Now, few, as I mentioned, ever saw him angry. When he got mad, one recalled, he'd just stiffen up a bit. And you'd look at those piercing blue eyes and you know you had gone too far. Yet even then, he never raised his voice. Another officer recalled that Nimitz was always in control of himself, calm in any emergency. That calm self-assurance communicated itself to those around him and acted like a bomb in excited moments at the most difficult of times. If the boss wasn't worried, maybe there's not that much to worry about. Now, in addition to these personal characteristics, another strength Nimitz brought to his job as the Pacific Fleet commander was his experience as head of the Bureau of Navigation in Washington. Now, navigation sounds like that's people who decide how the ships maneuver, but the Bureau of Navigation up to and into World War II was actually the personnel department. So Nimitz had to manage the officer assignments for every officer in the Navy, and he did such a good job of this, he was renewed for a second term. Now, his friends told him, Chester, this is a terrible idea. You know that the place to win promotion is at sea. You'll never get anywhere sitting at a desk in Washington moving papers around. Yet Nimitz's years in that job, I think, were crucial to his subsequent success in command at sea. First of all, the pre-war Navy was relatively small enough that Nimitz got to know, at least through their files, by name and reputation, if not face to face, every officer that he would ever deal with in the coming war above the rank of, say, commander. Second, his 2 tours in Washington made him comfortable with managing a large organization, the entire Navy officer corps, in fact, from a desk. And that is essentially what he had to do as CNCUS, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet. It would not fall to him to order course changes or launch planes or any of those kinds of tactical things. He would orchestrate the movements and decisions of those who did. And then finally, and this I think is important, Nimitz years in Washington made him comfortable, familiar with dealing with high-powered, often self-important decision makers in the capital. As the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, Nimitz was looked upon by those who served under him as almost godlike in his power. But he was himself responsible to others who thought of themselves as godlike. And it was important to learn how to deal effectively with his seniors without antagonizing them, to negotiate with his superiors without making it obvious that that's what he was doing. In the immediate aftermath of the December 7th attack, when he was sent to Pearl Harbor to take command, which he did on Christmas Day, 1941, his masters in Washington looked to him as a savior. But he knew that those high expectations would dissolve if he failed to live up to it. And no one had higher demands, short-tempered insistence than his immediate boss, the new commander of the United States Pacific Fleet, Ernest J. King. I have to be a little careful here. You heard Ryan introduce me to someone for the last 3 years was the Ernest J. King professor at the Naval War College. So I don't want to be too dismissive of the guy who funded my chair. But it would be difficult to find two men in the same profession with the same life experience who were more temperamentally different than Chester Nimitz and Ernie King. So severe was King's demeanor, so daunting his persona, that although his middle initial, J, stood for Joseph, some secretly referred to him as E. Jesus King. He was tall, slender, ruggedly handsome, attractive to women. King was a competent and efficient officer who worked as hard as any man in uniform. Men admired him for his expertise, his work ethic, his ability to get things done. But they also feared him for his high expectations, his uncompromising standards, and his sharp tongue. That was him. King was all business. He wasted no time on idle chatter. He certainly never told any humorous stories, risque or otherwise. There is no volume of the jokes of Ernest J. King. As one contemporary put it, he was logical, cutting, cold, and sparse with words. Another summarized him as a complicated, brilliant, ruthless...
Into New Jersey. The tour will be leaving in 10 minutes. Please come to the quarterdeck. Begin your tour from there. The tour will be leaving in 10 minutes.
All right, if you all get up and go to the tour, I will understand fully. I want to do it myself. But let me finish this up. A complicated, brilliant, ruthlessly ambitious man who never suffered fools willingly. Never suffered fools willingly. He happily, even proudly, embraced his reputation as a son of a bitch. And once he introduced himself to a group of younger officers, he said, "I'm Ernie King. You all know who I am. I am a self-appointed son of a bitch." He hated to waste time, and he believed that his time was more valuable than anyone else's. One story that came out of the research that I did was that if you walked into a barbershop and you were in the chair getting shaved, you got out of the chair and stood to one side half lathered while he got in and got his haircut and left. Then you could finish your haircut. King simply took that as his due. Once when he was leaving the Navy Yard in Washington, the main office in Washington for the Navy Yard, he strode out to the curb where a Navy car and a driver were parked alongside. And the driver, who was relatively new to the service, jumped up and opened the back door, and King said, "Navy Yard."
In New Jersey, any guest holding tickets for the guided tour will need to come to the quarterdeck immediately. The tour will be leaving in 5 minutes.
King would have had that guy shot. Anyway, he comes out to the curb. There's a car and a driver waiting for him. He opens the door, says, "Navy Yard." The driver says, "Your wish is my command." To which King answered, "You're goddamn right it is." Now that abrasive manner may have been why, despite a stellar Navy career, King had been overlooked for the top job as Chief Naval Operations in 1937, which went instead to Admiral Harold Stark, whose nickname was Betty. And if you don't know the story about why Admiral Stark was known as Betty Stark, you can ask me during Q&A. All right, so having missed the brass ring then, King decided that his career was probably over. They sent him to Newport to sit on the general board, mostly administrative job. But in 1940, with Pearl Harbor still a year away, Stark convinced Roosevelt that King was the man needed to whip the Atlantic Fleet into shape. The Atlantic Fleet, at that time, was engaged in an undeclared but nevertheless fully deadly war with German U-boats in the North Atlantic. So Roosevelt made the appointment, and King, as Stark promised he would, licked things into shape. He instituted wartime protocols, went to general quarters regularly, operated at night as well as in the daytime. Peacetime protocols, the ships would go out in the daytime, come back at night so everybody could sleep well. No, none of that. And consequently, a year later, when actual war did begin in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attack, Roosevelt called on King again, this time to take the top job as Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet. King is supposed to have said, "You know, when the shooting starts, that's when they send for the sons of bitches." Whether he actually said that or not, I don't know. But it does fit his personality. Now, gratified as he was to arrive at last at the top of his profession, King had some conditions. He actually sat down with Roosevelt and said, "Well, I'll do it under these circumstances. Number one, I don't want to have to deal with the bureau chiefs." Now, what you need to know about the Navy in the 1930s is that it was run by about 8 separate administrative bureaus. Oh, there's the CNO, who's in command of operations. But the Navy structure was managed by people who ran the Bureau of Aeronautics, the Bureau of Construction and Repair, the Bureau of Navigation, which after all Nimitz led, or the Bureau of Aeronautics, which King himself had led briefly. King said, "If I'm expected to be in command of a 2-ocean Navy, I don't want to deal with a bunch of paper-pushing bureau chiefs." Roosevelt said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it. If anybody gets in your way, I'll fire them." Okay, that's good. And King said, "I don't want to deal with the press. I hate the media. They're a bunch of creeps and liars. I want nothing to do with them." Roosevelt said, "Don't worry, I love the press. I'll hold a press conference every day. I have these radio chats that I do. It's really great. So you don't have to hold press conferences. You don't have to talk to reporters." Okay. He says, "I got one more." He says, "You know the title that you're going to give me, Commander-in-Chief United States. The abbreviation for that is the CNCUS, which is pronounced CNCUS." After Pearl Harbor, King said, that's just a bad joke. I don't want that title. I want to be called COMINCH for Commander-in-Chief. Roosevelt says, "Okay, that's fine with me." Then after King left, Roosevelt started thinking about it. He says, "You know, in the Constitution, there's only one Commander-in-Chief. That's me." So he sent his Chief of Staff, Admiral Leahy, to go see King. He said, "The boss would like you to change your title." King says, "Is that an order?" Leahy says, No, but the president would really appreciate it." King said, "If it's an order, I'll do it. Otherwise, I'm keeping the title I got." And he did. He was COMINCH for the rest of the war. Now, I mentioned earlier the presence of what was probably Spruant's standing desk in my office at the War College. There was also a giant painting on the wall. It was a painting of Alfred Thayer Mahan. I don't know if that's a name that resonates with anybody. Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote a book in 1890 in which he argued, among other things, that the oceans are a great common. You can go from one ocean to another all over the world. It's a useful metaphor for the fact that this was an interconnected and global naval war. So consistent with that, the order that made King COMINCH declared that for the purposes of exercising command, all oceans will be regarded as one area. King intended to take that literally. The day after his elevation to Comminch, he circulated an announcement that he would exercise direct and personal command over operations in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. 2 days later, he rescinded that order. He very likely still believed he was the best person to do it, but almost at once he discovered that he had too much on his plate to do it effectively. For one thing, as the head of the Navy, he had to meet regularly with the heads of the other services: George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army; Hap Arnold, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, then called the Army Air Force, and Leahy, too, who, as FDR's Chief of Staff, presided over this group. They didn't have a name yet, but they started referring to themselves as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a name that stuck and which we still use. In addition to that, King was also a member of what was called the Combined Chiefs of Staff. That's the American Joint Chiefs and the British heads of service who met as a group in Washington and pretty much ran the war. As a result, King estimated in his memoir he spent 2/3 of all his time in uniform dealing at the JCS or the CCS. He didn't have time to run the war. So he appointed Vice Admiral Royal Ingersoll to command the Atlantic Fleet and acknowledged that, yeah, okay, Nimitz would exercise actual command as well as nominal command of the Pacific Fleet. But he wanted to keep his hand on him if he could. And throughout the war, King sent Nimitz directives, occasional specific orders, and they met regularly face-to-face 16 times, usually in San Francisco, roughly halfway between Washington and Hawaii. Both fly in, have a conversation, fly home. King was not happy about this arrangement. He knew Nimitz was good at managing the halls of influence in Washington. He was, in King's view, what he called a fixer, a description not intended as a compliment. King did not perceive patience and accommodation or thoughtfulness, Nimitz's particular characteristics, as assets. King even wondered if Nimitz was tough enough for the job. Would he make hard calls? Would he discard officers who proved themselves unable to live up to the tempo and the pressures of wartime operations? He had too much patience. I could make a crack about King blowing a stack. In a word, he thought Nimitz wasn't enough of a son of a bitch. Now, throughout the Pacific War, there would be moments of frustration for both men. According to Nimitz's son, Chet, who was a submarine skipper during the war, his father never had anything but the highest praise for Admiral King. But Chet asked his father on a separate occasion, how do I handle a boss who's a bully? And Admiral Nimitz told his son that a frontal attack is seldom successful. Instead, he said, what you should do is be polite, keep your actual purpose to yourself, calmly and slowly remove the rug from under him. Nimitz knew full well that sympathy and compassion were not in King's makeup, so he adjusted. For his part, King was often frustrated by what he saw as Nimitz's benign passivity. It seemed to him Nimitz compromised too much. He would see both sides of an issue, seek a middle ground, traits not characteristic of E. Jesus King. But King discovered that the pressures of defending the Navy's interests from the Army, fending off proposals from the British for what King at least thought were diversionary projects, took so much of his time, he did not have an opportunity to straighten out Chester Nimitz. And that was just as well. Because like many others, King underestimated the steel that was at the core of Nimitz's benign exterior. Behind those cool blue eyes and enigmatic demeanor, beyond the humorous stories and instinctive empathy, there was a resolve and audacity that became especially evident when it was most needed. And we all benefited from that. I'm going to stop there, and hopefully you'll have some questions for me about either of these guys or anybody else in the command theater of the Pacific War, or any other topic you're interested in. Thank you. Okay. Come on, somebody be first. Yeah.
I'm going to steal it. Why is he called Betty?
Sure, why not? At the Naval Academy, in the 20th century, up to not so much today, it was still being done when I was teaching there in the 1970s and 80s. The upper class would give a nickname to every member of the plebe class. A new plebe class would come in and they would give him a nickname, you know, Baldy, Sonny, whatever it might be. And often these nicknames stayed with them through their life. I was a flag lieutenant for a vice admiral when I was in uniform, and I would type up his letters for him, among other things. And I'd send a letter, Dear Admiral so-and-so, and I'd take it in for the boss's signature, and he'd take a pen and he'd cross out Admiral so-and-so and write in Stinky. Dear Stinky, because that's how they knew each other at the academy. Now, I have no idea how Stinky got his name, but we do know how Betty got his name. And it came about this way. He was standing in formation, as plebes do a lot, and an upperclassman walked by and saw his name tag, which is stenciled on his shirt, and said, Stark. He said, Mr. Stark, are you related to General Stark? He said, Sir, I do not know who General Stark is, sir. Well, that's not the right answer. So the upperclassman informed him, well, Mr. Stark, let me tell you that General Stark was the commanding officer of the American forces at the Battle of Bennington in 1777. And he told his men before they went into battle, we will win today or Betty Stark will be a widow. And I want you to remember that. And to make sure you do, whenever you see an upperclassman in the yard, you are to shout out that phrase. We will win today or Betty Stark will be a widow. So he became known as Betty from that day forward. And signed all his official stationers. In the archives, there are letters to President Roosevelt from the Chief of Naval Operations, signed Betty. When FDR wrote him, he said, Dear Betty. I mean, it was universal that he was called Betty. But here's the punchline. General Stark's wife was named Molly. Thank you for asking that question. All right, somebody else. Yeah.
Just in speculation, during Operation Downfall, if it had happened, I'm curious what Nimitz's role would have been. You talked greatly about how he's been, very diplomatic. And, it's hard to be diplomatic with MacArthur. So I'm wondering what he would have done, or the Navy's role had that operation.
Yeah. Operation Downfall, for those who don't know it, is the operation for the invasion of Japan. It would have taken place late in 45 and then 46. Didn't happen, of course, because of the atomic bomb. Nimitz never favored an invasion. He was opposed to an invasion from the beginning. He believed that the blockade and bombing would convince the Japanese to give it up at some point. An invasion would be too costly, not only for American lives, but for Japanese lives. If they had this code that said we must fight to the death, how many hundreds of thousands, millions of Japanese would we have to kill for that invasion to succeed? So he was strongly against it. MacArthur, of course, thought it was going to be necessary. He was eager to do it, and he was going to command it. And in particular, he wanted the protocol established that he commanded the entire operation, not just the forces once they're on the beach and fighting their way inland. He wanted to command the amphibious operation. Well, that was in violation of every protocol that had been exercised throughout the Pacific landings, and for that matter at D-Day in Normandy too, which is that the Navy commander remains in command until the headquarters of the Army commander is established on the beach, at which time he assumes command. MacArthur's not acceptable. And he won the argument. He got the JCS to say that he would command the landing as well as the campaign ashore. Since that had never been done before, it's likely it might have been a bit dicey. But Nimitz was not going to pick up that fight. He continued to hope the invasion would not be necessary, and of course it turned out not to be necessary. But you ask about their relationship. It is an interesting one because, like King and Nimitz, MacArthur and Nimitz, very different types. MacArthur was a cooperative consensus builder. MacArthur was an imperious commander. But Nimitz went out of his way to be cooperative with MacArthur at every opportunity. He kept 2 photographs on his desk. You're going to assume one was his wife, Catherine. No. One was from FDR. To Chester, from your good friend, Franklin Roosevelt. The other photograph? Arthur. Yeah. And somebody asked him once, I don't have a good footnote for the source of this, so it may not be true, but I'm going to tell it anyway, which is that when an officer asked him, why do you keep a picture of MacArthur on your desk? Nimitz is supposed to have said, it's to remind me not to give out Jovian pronouncements. Now, he may not, in fact, have said that, but I do think that's why he kept it there. This is your counterpart. Remember that. Don't be that guy. Anybody else? Yeah.
Began his career as a submariner, and his son became a submariner.
Yes.
Hypothetical question, if he had not had the experience, the thorough experience of submarines going into the Second World War, how differently would he have conducted that operation in the Pacific?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, it's speculative, so I can say anything I want. But I suspect the answer, the short answer, and then I'm going to give a long answer because I do that. I suspect the short answer is very little different. I think he understood when he took command on the last day of 1941, New Year's Eve, 1941, when he assumed the job, with the battleship fleet out of action, and only 3 aircraft carriers, the 4th was coming over from the Atlantic, but right now only 3 aircraft carrier groups. His principal offensive weapon was the submarines. It was the only realistic way he could strike back in any strategic way at the Japanese. And I think he would have known that if he had never been in a submarine. But remember too, in the years before the war, he served in submarines and got to be a submarine commander, but he also served as chief of staff to Admiral Robinson in the First World War, where he was in charge of logistics and oil and all sorts of things. He's the one who came up with the side-by-side underway refueling protocols and a lot of other aspects of the war. One of the things the Navy did then and still does today is they put you in a job, which you spend a year learning, a year executing, and then a year figuring out how to hand off, and then you go do some other job. And of course, Nimitz did a lot of that as well. In addition to those tours in Washington I mentioned, he'd been on an oiler, he'd been a commander of the cruiser Augusta, in command of the East Asian Squadron. So he'd been a surface warfare officer as well as a submarine officer. He did not have the wings of an aviator, and that became an issue during his period of command, because the aviators in World War II thought they were a separate and elite group and disliked and distrusted the fact that ship drivers like Nimitz were telling them what to do. That was a kind of constant tension in the war. But to answer your question, I think the fact that his son went into submarines is interesting, but I don't think it was determinative. Interestingly enough, Spruance's son, Edward, also went into the submarine service against his father's advice. Ray Spruance told me, not dead end, don't do that. Edward did it anyway. I think that was a little bit of, watch me assert myself, Dad. Anyway, that's that. But good question. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Would either of these guys made it to the top in today's Navy?
Oh, what a good question. I think Nimitz was more likely to get to the top in today's Navy. Now remember, King did not get to the top, even of that Navy, until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And as King said, when the shooting starts, that's when they sent for the sons of bitches. We want, like, and frankly need commanders today who have the kind of political sensitivity that Chester Nimitz had. Now, King was politically savvy, but he was a blunt instrument rather than a rapier. He would have worked with a saber rather than a foil. And that doesn't work as well in peacetime. You've got to get along to go along in peacetime, then as well as now. So the kind of sensitivity necessary to be effective in high command has always been there. There's a tendency in wartime to say, all right, now's the time for these crazy people to get in charge. Let's give Patton an army. Let's make Cole Halsey a fleet commander. And you need those guys. But you also need guys like Nimitz. And we have seen in the last year occasions when high military commanders have had to make politically sensitive decisions in the interest of the country. That's not new, and is ubiquitous in military command. There, get political, how's that? Bob, I can't believe you don't have a question. You set this up, come on, man.
I think for me, back to Ernest King, the way he was, would you think that Ernest King, if he hadn't been that type of person he was, would he have been higher? Not necessarily politically savvy, but not as much as the, son of Nimitz as you put it. If he was less like that, would he have been up with Nimitz?
Yeah, I think it's possible. He was under consideration for Chief of Naval Operations in 1937, and argument can be made maybe he should have gotten it. If you look at his track record as an officer, he was phenomenal. I mean, he did just amazing things. He did jobs other people said that can't be done, and he took it over and did it quickly, and did it efficiently, and did it well. He was a hardworking and efficient naval officer. But he was brusque. He was a bull in a china shop. He pushed people aside who got in his way. Well, you heard the story about, the barber's chair, for example, which is a metaphor for the way he treated other people. And you make enemies doing that. There are rumors, which I frankly discount, that he was, in his personal life, disreputable. He supposedly had affairs with other men's wives, that he was a drunk, and so on. I think those are mostly stories by people to whom he was rude. And I doubt that most of them, if any, or any of them, are true. But he was brusque, he was blunt, and you can't get to the top of anything with those kinds of characteristics, absent a crisis like the Second World War. So just as Winston Churchill was an indifferent politician for most of his life, but met the moment when the skills, and particularly the language that he deployed, were exactly what was needed in 1939 and 1940, so too Ernie King, hardworking as he was, his brusqueness, that's the polite word, would probably have kept him out of high command, absent the moment of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Is that responsive to your question?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, anybody else? You got that? Yes!
Silly question. Did
No such
Nimitz
thing.
ever get his teeth fixed?
Do I what?
Did Nimitz ever get his teeth fixed?
Mostly. There's a wonderful letter he wrote to, all right, in January of 1945, as the war was moving west toward Japan, Nimitz moved his headquarters from Pearl Harbor, a long way away from the fleet action, out to Guam, and set up a new headquarters in Guam because he could get to the front faster, he could get there and back in a day, he could communicate more effectively with his subordinates and so on. So before he left, he went for a full physical. He was great health, thank you very much. I mean, this is a guy, one thing I didn't tell you about him is he was a physical fitness nut. He walked 3 miles before breakfast every day at 6:30. He walked 7 miles every afternoon before dinner. One of his favorite things was to go to a beach, now called Nimitz Beach, by the way, in Hawaii, where, and he'd invite officers to go with him. Few went more than once because they knew what was coming. He'd get to the beach and he'd say, all right, let's go. And he'd swim straight out for half a mile, straight out to sea. Then he'd turn 90 degrees and swim along the coast for 2 miles. And then he'd swim ashore, and then he'd walk 5 miles. Well, nobody else could do this. Except, you want to guess who? Spruance was the guy. Spruance could keep up with him, and sometimes even kept going.
Spruance or Halsey, but I didn't think it would be.
It was Spruance. It was Spruance. You're absolutely right.
Halsey's too much.
Yeah, Halsey's the exactly right. So when he went to Guam, he got his physical, and he's in great health, but he went to the dentist. And of course, here's this record from the dentist. Created him what Nimitz described to his wife as a new set of choppers, store-bought choppers. So he got false teeth, both sides, uppers and lowers. I think he still had the gold teeth in front. We know that because he appeared on the cover of Life magazine in March of 1944. And the photographer caught him unawares, because instead of that tight-lipped. His lips are just parted, and you can see the little glint of gold right there on the front of his teeth. So I think the gold teeth stayed there all the way until he died in 1966. So he sort of got them fixed, I guess, is the answer to the question. Okay. Anybody else?
It's not really a question, I'm sorry. Nimitz was offered command of the Pacific before Husband Kimmel? Okay, so would you say that was because he was now known in the circles of Washington, that's why he would have been left?
Yeah, remember he did those 2 tours as head of the Bureau of Navigation. He dealt with FDR regularly. When Franklin Roosevelt called the house, he always asked for Chester. I mean, they were close enough. Remember the photograph on the desk, to my good friend, that FDR knew of him, as did his Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox. And in 1940, when they were looking for somebody to head the Pacific Fleet, FDR wanted to name Nimitz as the commander. Nimitz turned it down. They offered it to him, he said no. He says, there are 33 officers senior to me who want that job. It will create great resentment. I'm too young. You should name somebody else.
But because of the attack, that was more of a justification to, just as King was moved in to command.
Yeah, well, what happened then, of course, the guy he named was Husband Kimmel. And Kimmel's out in Pearl Harbor, and December 7th comes, and he's standing out on his lawn watching the fleet being sunk. Some of you may know he was actually hit by a spent bullet, hit him in the chest, bounced to the ground. Later said, I wish it had killed me. Nimitz told him, by the way, it's not your fault, it could have happened to anybody, and of course it could have happened to him. Had he accepted that job and been in Pearl Harbor December 7th, there are people who are defenders of Nimitz who say, oh no, he would have been better prepared. Maybe, but probably not. And consequently, it would have been Nimitz and not Kimmel who was shelved for the duration of the war, and we would have lost those services, and that would have been very deleterious to the United States had that happened. So yeah, he was offered it early, he turned it down, and then when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, FDR called in Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy, he said, you tell Nimitz to get the hell out to Pearl Harbor and don't come back until the war is won. So he can't say no this time. Get out there. And he did. And he did stay out. He was in Pearl Harbor on the 31st of December 1941. He was on board the Missouri on September, help me out here, 2nd, 1945, to sign the instrument of surrender. So he did just what FDR told him. He got the hell out to Pearl Harbor and he stayed there until he went to Guam, until the war was won. Okay, we worn out? All right, thank you everybody.
Actually, reminds me, I did love that video of why it was the Missouri.